Thank you very much for being here. The schedule for the evening is one that's focused on adult ADHD, but as we all know, it's a lifespan challenge, and I'm going to introduce the topic, and then 15 minutes later, Dr. Ann Bailey is going to continue with a content and a sneak peek. Context, pardon me. And then Laura McNiven is going to follow with a 15-minute presentation of living forever with ADHD. And then we'll welcome your questions. We hope that it'll be an evening of hope and education. We want to keep you entertained and answer your questions. We want to build some momentum about the huge advantage of treating early and reducing stigma. And we want to share some of our personal and professional passion for ADHD wellness. Why is it that ADHD has become my passion? And why is it only one mental health diagnosis, one of many mental health diagnoses that continues to be enshrouded by myths, stigma, and questionable acknowledgement? Very often, anxiety, depression, learning disabilities, substance use, or misuse can overlap with an ADHD diagnosis. Hopefully, we'll empower you tonight to recognize some of the common objectives that we have learned. Let me tell you a little bit about me. I started working with ADHD in the early 1990s in London, Ontario. I was one of several physicians that was working out of the health unit at the time, and we looked after school-aged children with mental health diagnoses. As I matured with learning the qualities of ADHD and the treatment options, there have been so many changes in the last 25 years. In 2009, I opened Springboard with Laura McNiven, and we chose to look at just ADHD across the lifespan. Well, little did we know that just ADHD doesn't really exist. Everyone with ADHD is a person first. They're part of a family. They have responsibilities. And very seldom do they have ADHD stamped on their forehead, which would make it much easier for us. The value of early diagnosis and identification optimizes the treatment that we have at our fingertips. Selfishly, I find it really hard not to keep working because I have learned so much from my patients. Their narratives and their stories have become my inspiration because so many ADHD people not only have survived, but thrived by being resilient, determined, and creative in very unique ways. Let's look briefly at a definition of ADHD. I'm not going to read it out loud. It's very straightforward. It is the most studied childhood mental health disorder globally. It tends to present in three types: the inattentive, hyperactive, impulsive, and combined. Adults tend to lose their hyperactive, impulsive behavior, but it shifts into mental hyperactivity, distractibility, and impulsivity. Approximately 80% of ADHD is inherited. It's a family affair. And 20% may be due to environmental factors. And that's a conversation for another evening. But it does give you an appreciation for how inheritable it can be. I think it's important to think of the brain as being something that with ADHD needs glasses. In other words, when you put on the glasses of medication support, for example, things come into focus. When you take the glasses off, the medication doesn't work as well as a metaphoric analogy. We can talk about that more if you're interested. Why do we screen? Screening enables diagnosis, intervention, and then goals can be identified to get a success-focused action plan. Why do we treat? If untreated, and that's a very important point, if untreated, there's 5 times the risk for depression, 25 times the risk of substance misuse or abuse, and more importantly, by treating, we're going to end up decreasing the impairment that may be presenting. Early identification is success-focused. That's why we want you to go home thinking about whether or not ADHD is part of your life. How many people have it? 4.4% of the North American population, which comes out to about 1.6 million Canadians. Now that is probably a formal diagnosis. However, there's also impairment from symptoms of ADHD because it's very definitely on a continuum. 41% of adult ADHD cases are considered severe. It is not just a childhood diagnosis. 60% of children who are diagnosed will continue to experience symptoms as an adult. And I think that's low. Less than 20% will seek treatment. It's very much a closet situation. Why do we take ADHD seriously? Without treatment, there's underachievement, difficulty with relationships, increased use of substances, elevated numbers of motor vehicle accidents. In other words, you're more likely, 50% more likely to be in a serious car crash with untreated ADHD. One statistic said you have 3 times more likely the chance of being dead by the age of 45. That sounds kind of scary. But I do think it's important to minimize the secondary mood and anxiety diagnoses, depression, personality disorders that may be masked by the unsupported ADHD. Treatment makes a difference. Impairment needs to take a look at all areas of well-being, which a good assessment should consider. We've told you that early intervention reduces secondary effects, and the whole family support has best outcomes. It can be very difficult to diagnose and assess whether something is a primary or a secondary issue. At the clinic, we've often had parents coming in with children that have been recognized to have ADHD, and often the parent, usually the mother, will talk about episodic periods in their 30s or 40s where they had treatment-resistant mood and anxiety issues. Well, that's a perfect example of how their sadness and their apprehension may have been treated, but that wasn't the root of the problem. And when those secondary issues were identified and the ADHD became diagnosed, both the parents and the children did better. I love this cartoon. That probably could have happened in my house with my kids. Mom's going out carrying the lunchbox, and the son is coming out to exchange with her briefcase. It certainly is a family affair. How do we treat ADHD? At Springboard, we search for strengths. ADHD is not to be judged as a bad thing to have. Identifying a game plan with the challenges that are confronting you is important. People come into Springboard for a reason, and many of them have never considered having ADHD. Often they're educated postgraduate individuals in professional careers, and they've been told, often by the medical profession, you couldn't possibly have ADHD. You're a teacher or a lawyer or an engineer, And that's not true. Sometimes people that are very bright, hardworking, and capable have masked their symptoms until all of a sudden a breaking point. Difficulty holding a job, difficulty staying in university. The twins arrive. You can imagine all the tipping points that may bring people to the clinic. We do feel that pharmaceutical support, when appropriate, needs to be combined with coaching and behavioral strategies. Medication use is evidence-based to be protective and effective, but we feel that that needs supervision and guidance in helping you to take advantage of these new glasses, this new opportunity to focus in the world that you will get with support. What gets in the way of treatment? Stigma, myths, fear, lack of resources. And unfortunately, this is a challenge to be addressed in many mental health diagnoses. And as we learn more about the genetic qualities of mental health diagnoses, there's more and more connection between a mental health diagnosis, including ADHD. Stigma, as you can read on the slide, is the negative attitude in treatment due to a characteristic. Attitudes may be hard to recognize, especially with mental illness, and stigma has many sources, including the following: individual, healthcare provider, parents, loved ones, school and work environments, past experiences. By lifting the veil of stigma and not embracing the ever-growing resource options, we need to be changed. Our hope is to make individuals with ADHD less apprehensive to seek health, and health practitioners less afraid to screen and treat. We know, particularly with children, that as many as 40 to 50% of parents who have a child with a mental health diagnosis will not tell anyone. We know that many adults will not tell their employer they have ADHD, and the negative comments that they may have, lazy, stupid, bad, can trigger shame in patients. Much more to think of patients as being creative, energetic, fun, and most importantly, unique. Stigma with ADHD is not taken seriously enough. People joke about it. Oh, he or she has ADHD. It is still judged by society and even by the individual. Everyone's brain is different. Let's find some compassion. Common myths. Everyone has ADHD nowadays. ADHD is very much a questionable diagnosis, but it's most highly researched, and it is a chronic disorder that has huge societal costs. It is definitely real. Oh, myth number 2, it's not just a childhood disorder, and we've talked about that. 65% of children will continue when they are grown up with persistent symptoms into their adulthood. ADHD is overdiagnosed. No, I don't think so. In fact, it's often misdiagnosed. Prevalence rates of ADHD range from 2 to 9%, with roughly 5% in adults, and as many as 3% of adults over the age of 60 will continue to present with symptoms and signs of ADHD and have impairment. At the clinic, we have diagnosed people in their 70s, and when you backtrack their school report cards, which some people still have, if you can believe it, and with appropriate intervention, their lives have been improved. Number 4, ADHD patients are over-medicated. That's not true either. Medication rates have gone up, but researchers believe this reflects a better diagnosis and more effective treatment. We are so fortunate with the long-acting medications that have been developed in the last decade. Number 5, females have lower rates of ADHD than males. Girls have lower rates of diagnosis than boys. They are less likely to receive a diagnosis because boys tend to have more hyperactivity and externalizing disorders. But by the time they're adults, it's 50-50, men and women. Number 6, stimulant medications lead to drug abuse and addiction. That is totally incorrect. The opposite is true. If untreated, we've talked about some of the societal costs. The side effects of not treating ADHD with adults, including anxiety, depression, and some of the other complications, definitely make us realize that medication can be protective. Remember, an ADHD diagnosis is not an endpoint, but a beginning. So number 7, you can be successful and have ADHD. And you'll learn more about that this evening. Whoops. How do we move forward together? We see, feel, and participate in stories of hope every day in the clinic. We understand and recognize how important the brain and mental wellness is. It needs our respect and our attention. Keep talking about mental health. We share stories of hope and resilience. We try very hard to help those that are struggling. We try and make it safe to tell the truth. And we're excited to tell you people about ADHD tonight. So the last slide just has a few words from our book. And we believe in you. We've heard story after story of hope. We love working in the field of ADHD precisely for that reason. We truly feel that ADHD doesn't have to hold you back, and we wish you the best as you move forward. We know that your story, too, can be one of inspiration. We've seen it happen. May I now introduce our second speaker, Dr. Ann Bailey.
I am so excited to be here. This workbook has been in the making for quite some time, and we really hope that it helps a ton of people. I thought I'd just provide some context about what we were thinking about when we came up with this workbook, and obviously a sneak peek. My PhD thesis was in neuroscience, so I was in awe of the human brain and continue to be. So I thought I'd share a little bit to sort of set the stage for us. We have amazing brains. On average, there's 86 billion neurons, obviously, give or take a few. These neurons are basically made up of 2 parts. There's gray matter, the cell bodies. There's white matter, the axons. And these neurons communicate by releasing and accepting neurotransmitters. There's a lot of different neurotransmitters, too. Neurons fire quickly and constantly, 1 to 200 spikes per second. Not only do they release neurotransmitters to another neuron, but sometimes they do that in order to block a message from getting sent to another neuron. So it's safe to say that our brains are pretty complicated. So how do we study the brain? Well, if we're talking about basics, there are 2 general ways that neuroscientists study our brains. One is by looking at brain structure. Is this part of the brain bigger or smaller in this group of people compared to that group of people? Is the gray matter in this area thicker or thinner? That white matter that I mentioned, those axon bundles, do they connect the same regions as strongly in one group as they do as in another? Those are all looking at differences in brain structure. Another way to study the brain is looking at brain function. When we ask people to perform a task or activity, how does the brain function? A really common example of this is fMRI, which looks at changes in blood flow, which is thought to be an indirect measure of neurons firing and talking to each other. So, what do we know about the ADHD brain? Well, in our workbook, we basically talk about 2 areas that are of importance for our clients. One, the prefrontal cortex, that front part of the brain, we call it the conductor. If you think of your brain as an orchestra, that front part is the conductor. When everything's going well and the conductor's doing their job, the music sounds great. That conductor's actually in charge of a series of tasks called executive functions. All the different skills we use to execute tasks from start to finish in an efficient way. Paying attention is one of them, but inhibiting impulses is another. Storing things in our memory in order to pull on them later or in the moment. Starting a task, planning out a task, and the list goes on. If this hasn't already kind of started ringing bells for some of our clients or people in the audience, in an ADHD brain, this conductor doesn't always do the job so well. Sometimes the conductor's awake and does a really good job if something's new and interesting, or if there's a sense of urgency, but sometimes the conductor's sleeping, and it's not really up to that individual with ADHD. The second area I wanted to highlight is something called the limbic system. It's a subset of structures, it's a little deeper in the brain, and it helps us with motivation, it helps us with those strong emotions like fear and pleasure, helps us with long-term memories and general learning. So these two areas tend to act a little bit differently for people with ADHD. It's not that our clients can't pay attention, it's that sometimes they hyperfocus, sometimes they don't pay attention. It sometimes depends on their motivation, which if you think about it, it's really hard to control your motivation. It more has to do with what we find rewarding or interesting. There's still a lot to learn and discover about the ADHD brain. Remember those pretty slides I showed you in the previous picture? Those are pretty much distilled. There's a lot of steps that researchers go through to analyze that data and get those pretty images. So it's not at all surprising that not all studies find the exact same results, and that the differences when you're comparing an ADHD brain with someone who doesn't have ADHD might shift as someone grows up or as development happens. And of course, with technology the way it is, there are tons of new ways to study the brain. For anyone who has ADHD or struggles with another mental health issue, or generally isn't interested in self-improvement, one of the most exciting concepts to come out of neuroscience is something called neuroplasticity. This idea that through actions and through our behavior, we can actually change our brain structure or our brain function. It's not fixed, like for a long time I think people thought. There was a very exciting and straightforward study that came out that took a group of people who did not know how to juggle, scanned their brains, taught them how to juggle, and encouraged them to practice a fair amount, and then scanned their brains at the end. And unsurprisingly, they found differences in the visual and motor areas of the brain, the areas that one would use when juggling. Looking at music neuroscience, which is what my thesis was in, demonstrates that musician brains tend to be different than non-musician brains in the areas of auditory and motor. And mindfulness, something I'm a little less familiar with, but is becoming very exciting, is starting to show differences associated with changes in that prefrontal cortex, the area in charge of attention that I mentioned before. So I obviously have a lot of respect for neuroscience, but the reason I even went into psychology was because I wanted to be a talk therapist. So I got my degree as a clinical psychologist, and I have a lot of respect for psychotherapy. And one of the really exciting things that's coming out in psychotherapy and gaining recognition is this idea of self-acceptance. So as a clinician, I do encourage clients to work towards self-acceptance. Know your symptoms of ADHD. Know which executive functions are getting in your way. But exercise self-compassion and treat yourself with respect. So working towards self-acceptance tends to lead to change in a different way. I encourage people to be empathetic and be gentle with themselves. And that tends to be more empowering and more motivating, much to everyone's belief that self-criticism is the way to go. Accepting ADHD within a relationship can result in a sense of unconditional support and a strong emotional bond. Brené Brown has been spreading the message that vulnerability drives connection. Being very open and understanding about your own shortcomings can actually create and drive social connections. For those with ADHD, self-acceptance is not, I will remember next time. It doesn't mean, I can do it, I just need to find more time in my day. It doesn't mean, I don't believe I messed up again, what is wrong with me? It also doesn't mean, I don't need to look at my calendar, I know my schedule. But other people are able to do it, why can't I? These sentences we hear from our clients all the time, but it's not really accepting the fact that ADHD is in the picture. Sentences that sort of highlight self-acceptance are more along the lines of these. I forget things, so I better write this down. I can't seem to fit this in my day. I need to cut out a different activity. I'm struggling. I need to try doing things differently. I don't always remember my schedule. I will check my calendar. I don't know what it's like to be anyone else, but I need to figure out how to live my life. This type of task will take a lot of cognitive effort for me, so I better allow more time for me to complete it. Self-compassion is not entirely different than self-acceptance. I mentioned it before. The truth is that living with ADHD is not an easy thing. When you're living in a world that expects and demands consistent executive functioning on a daily basis, yet so many clients that we work with are hard on themselves. They are getting frustrated with themselves, they're engaging in negative self-talk, they have high expectations, and all in an effort to do better and do more. This actually isn't an effective motivational technique. It's not on the list of activities that correlates with brain structure as far as I know. It gives the flavor of a motivational strategy, but every time it kind of gives a dash of emotional damage for that individual. So if I were you right now, I would say, okay, so which is it? You just told me I can change my brain, and now you're telling me I should accept myself. Well, part of why I think we wrote this workbook, and at Springboard, what we encourage people to do is actually a bit of both. It's not an either-or situation. Anyone who's received a diagnosis of ADHD is immediately met with this list of compensatory actions: reminders, daily to-dos, timers, energy breaks, using apps, alarms, etc., etc., etc. And the whole idea is to incorporate these strategies in order to manage signs and symptoms of ADHD. But this requires a lot of hard work and determination on a daily basis. It's not simple. It sounds simple. One by one, you're like, I can do that, I can do that, I can do that, but it adds up. And the reason it's hard, and Dr. Gray mentioned this earlier, is there's some pretty strong and important obstacles that people run into. Denial's a really strong one. Shame and guilt. Criticism from others, which can then lead to defensiveness. The idea of reporting to loved ones actually can negatively alter motivation. Anger, resentment can build. And of course, there's just general fatigue from trying to spin your wheels so much in order to compensate for how your brain naturally works. In our workbook, we've introduced 4 characters: Jason, Candace, Tim, and Amy. And they take the reader along their ADHD journey. They give their responses to the exercises just along with the reader. For us, they represent resilience, growth, optimism, and strength. It's really important to note that they are not based on any single client. They're based on the collective stories that we've heard over and over and over again. Let's take a closer look at Amy and take a look at her ADHD journey. Amy's 47 years old. She has a loving and supportive husband and 3 kids. She's active, energetic, talkative, and works really hard to do it all. This part's important. As a child, Amy felt she was smart, but thought teachers never liked her. They seemed to be annoyed when she talked in class or blurted out answers. She even remembers a teacher taping her mouth shut to help her pay attention. Amy enjoyed playing sports and was on numerous teams in high school. She never really liked school, though, and didn't go to college or university. She stumbled into work immediately, started working as a waitress, then an admin assistant, which was not fun, and finally landed in the area of personal training. She loved working with people and being active. Her clients liked her too, and she got them results. She was charismatic with people. But Amy had trouble with that scheduling part, and sometimes mixed up appointment times. Remember that planning as an executive function? After her 3rd child, she decided to stay at home with her kids instead of returning to work. But at home, scheduling became stressful as her children grew up and got more involved in activities. She would forget some of the kids' activities, the house was a mess more often than not, and their meals were usually last minute based on what was in the fridge or takeout. Now, some of you might be sitting in the audience and say, oh my gosh, I think every mother of 3 I know has ADHD. But it's not quite that simple. There's that childhood piece that I mentioned before, and then this part underneath Amy's face. Amy wasn't feeling like herself. She didn't enjoy what her life had become. She couldn't do the activities she once enjoyed and had even started to lose interest in things that used to make her smile. She was losing her sense of identity. Eventually, she stopped making the effort to see friends or get out of the house. And that's when she went for an assessment. She was diagnosed with depression, as well as ADHD, the combined presentation. She wasn't surprised about the depression, but she didn't know anything about ADHD. At first, she didn't believe it, but decided to look into it, learn more about what this might mean for her and her family. And that decision would be the key to unlocking her spinning life, stepping off the roller coaster, and helping her understand why things had become what they had. In our book, may we have your attention, please? The reader's taken through a series of sections that are listed on this slide. They can jump around in true ADHD format. They can go in order if they feel like it, but I'm going to take you right into one of the activities in your brain in ADHD. The reader's educated and informed about those executive functions that I mentioned. And let's hear what Amy has to say once she learned about those executive functions. It's funny, you only really ever know your way of doing things. So when I started learning about the prefrontal cortex and the limbic system, I realized that lots of people have different ways of getting things done and going about their days. Like my natural state is bouncing from one thing to the next and back again. Somehow I make my way through things, but it was really important for me to understand how I go about trying to get things done. It's made a big difference in how I motivate myself to tackle the family calendar, the laundry, and especially meals and groceries. One of the activities in this section, which is really important, is this idea of separating yourself from your symptoms. In this section, readers are asked to go through their symptoms of ADHD and take a hard look at them and try and be objective. They're also asked to go through those executive functions and decide which ones for them are problematic. But this is also important because when Dr. Gray talks about hope and when Laura talks about resilience, it's the stories that we've heard and what we encourage people to do. People aren't necessarily their ADHD. So this activity is about encouraging the reader to separate themselves from those symptoms. If Amy were to fill this out, a possible situation would be, well, I haven't gotten enough done in the day. You could carry that on. Her usual interpretation, which makes sense, I'm not trying hard enough, I'm lazy, what's wrong with me? A very emotional interpretation. But through the ADHD lens, a reinterpretation is, I jump from task to task, which is actually the opposite of being lazy, by the way. I'm not planning out my day. Also, looking at those executive functions. So already we encourage readers to stop thinking about themselves through that emotional lens and personal lens and start changing that language that they use with themselves. Another section called Taking the Lead with ADHD, I'm going to draw attention to because there's another important activity in that section. It's about blockers. Our clients have the best of intentions. The number of times I've heard adult clients say, I want to do this, but my brain's not with me. The intentions are good, those executive functions just aren't on their side all the time. So this activity is about asking the reader to make a goal. In Amy's situation, make a meal plan. And then anticipate the blockers. What might block me from attaining that? Am I going to get distracted? Am I going to be indecisive? I'm going to run out of time. I might jump from day to day and never decide. And then it encourages people to come up with strategies to actually overcome these blockers. Chunk it up. Set a timer to create a sense of urgency, or pick a meal by the time it goes off. Put myself in a place with few visual distractions, put my phone on silent, try using an app for meal planning to help me. Technology sometimes adds that boost of novelty for our clients. Let's hear what Amy had to say once she learned about blockers. I eventually figured out that what was blocking me from doing what I actually wanted were mostly micro things. I was this chicken running around with my head cut off, with no particular plan or direction, all under the guise of being productive and doing everything for everyone. My path to transformation was all in the micros, the smallest little blockers that were getting in the way and their obvious mini solutions. Like the voice that said, I'm not going to the gym because I need 2 hours. I know better. I know that even 20 minutes will help me. I need to keep running shoes in the car so I can grab a run when I drop the kids off. So, based on my talk, there is a bit of an ADHD dilemma. When you get this diagnosed, do you work towards change and beating ADHD, or do you work towards accepting it? And at Springboard, we encourage people to realize it's not an either or. There are times where it pays dividends to make choices that change our brains, develop habits that help us manage those symptoms, but it's equally important to be self-aware and practice self-compassion. It's really important to know your blockers and form habits to help you outsmart your ADHD. I do believe this, as a professional and as a person, that accepting ourselves and our shortcomings will not make us weak or lesser. It actually leads to increased happiness and health. We really hope that this book helps a lot of people, so I thank you for your time.
So I've entitled my talk, Living Forever with ADHD. will self-awareness set you free? Because I am finding that to be sort of the biggest question I'm asking myself right now, having worked with clients, hundreds of clients over the last number of years and dealt with attention issues myself. I'm really starting to ask that question in sort of a longitudinal way, in a lifespan way. So again, I'm going to define ADHD one more time, but just to highlight a couple of things that I think that are really important when we talk about ADHD. So as Dr. Gray said, it's not just a set of symptoms. It's a brain difference. And we're going to learn, I think, a lot more over the next number of years through the brain science examples that Anne was sharing, as we start to figure out exactly what's happening with the neurotransmitters in the prefrontal cortex. We know that it's inconsistent neurotransmitters. We know that people can hyperfocus and then they underfocus. So that there's an actual brain difference happening is so crucial to the way that I see ADHD. Your version of ADHD is unique to you. So although we see themes all the time from the many, many individuals we've worked with, there is always a very unique story to each person. So it's really never boring, and it's funny because when we hire people to work at the clinic, we sometimes say, how do you feel about working with sort of just ADHD? And sometimes people will say, yeah, I'm not sure. And then they get into it and say like, oh, there's so much, like it's fascinating and interesting. And even though there are themes that are really similar, it's challenging, and every single story is amazing to listen to. And in my view, if you have ADHD, you have to figure out your own pathway forward. So lots of support and lots of different strategies, and we can talk about that, but we really wanted to make this workbook be centered on your journey and customizable for you. You need to face it, own it, and stay on top of it. I'm going to talk a little bit more about how that looks. And ask that question throughout this conversation. How do you live forever with an ADHD style brain? It's one thing to go for a diagnosis and then get an assessment and learn about it and work on it for a little bit, but what about living with it forever? How does that look? So let's start with my story about ADHD. I had no idea that I had attention issues until grad school. So we can start with my childhood, where every single one of my report cards said, if you tried harder, you would do better. Literally every single one. And if you met me, I'm like this enthusiastic, pleasing, energetic individual with an academic family, and every single one of my report cards said, if you tried harder, you would do better. By teenage years, I'm going to call that sort of my shame and a game years. So I felt shame about not being good at things and was extremely upset when I couldn't get things done, because I felt smart. And that was the thing, is that I felt smart, but I couldn't get things done the same way. So that was stressful. And then I started learning how to play the game. So figuring out how I could pull it off, essentially, which is that feeling where you're not really feeling like your best self. You're like, that exam's coming, I'm going to figure out a way to sort of last minute pull it together. And I see some friendly faces in this crowd of people that I've known a long time and know what that was like for me. So by the time I got to my undergrad years, I was sprinting with my essays to the final deadlines, trying to get extensions on everything. And it was extremely anxiety provoking. And I had no idea why. And you can say everyone procrastinates sometimes, and that's true. And I certainly don't feel that I had an extreme case of ADHD, but wherever it fits, for me, it felt extremely stressful to go through life feeling like you're always behind and not sure if you're going to be able to trust your brain when you need to. And then by my graduate years, somehow I sort of had this aha moment, partially I think because I was working in something I was really passionate about, and partially because I couldn't handle the anxiety anymore. I started to learn how to control my brain a bit. I don't want to feel like that, so I have to do it sooner. And I started to be able to sort of meet these deadlines. And through my 20s, sort of taking control of symptoms. But that still wasn't my best self. That was, I learned that, okay, if I do this and this, I can get my work done. And could sort of create my like perfect balance where the lightning would hit me and I could pull it off. And then really, as I started to work at Springboard in my 20s and 30s, I started to go through this process of saying, okay, first of all, coming to terms with, I have attention issues. And that's why I'm so passionate about this area of work. And then starting to get that feeling where I knew I needed to learn about my own brain and learn about how this made sense. And I didn't want it to be the conversation of, you can't do this, this, and this. I wanted it to be different. I wanted it to be like, well, why is the brain making me feel that way? Why do I have trouble doing that? And how do we change that? And so I really wanted to go through this process of finding myself. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that because that's been the foundation of Springboard's program, and it's the foundation of our book. And so it's so neat to go through a process where essentially I was going through this process, and as I went through it, we built a program about it. So I was trying to figure out, well, I don't want to be my symptoms, I want to be me. And so how do we pull apart this process and sort of create a program that works really well for people? And from here forward, I think the answer is a continuous recalibration, asking regularly, what do I need to change? What do I need to do to sort of be my best self? So I get the ADHD feeling. I know that feeling, how sometimes my brain will just turn into gear and I can fly and make connections, and it all comes together. And then in contrast, the slowness I can experience when I'm faced with a challenge. It's probably something pretty simple, but it's hard for me, and I feel anxiety bubble up, and I just want to give up before I even try. It's a mix of embarrassment and shame, and it can make me feel defensive and pull away. That's what ADHD feels like to me. But how do I live with it? I've done the emotional work. I've stared it down and thought about it and realized where my strengths are and asked myself where my challenges are. And I've done that to a pretty deep level. I don't let my guard down. I don't pretend that I don't have attention issues. I'm aware of it and I keep working with it. I'm willing to be vulnerable. I'm willing to say, yeah, I'm not good at that, or I really struggle with that. I ask for help, and the number of people, this is probably worth noting, that helped create this book was a lot of people, and they were so important to each part of pulling this together. There's no way Anne and I and Dr. Gray could have done this on our own. We had so much help. I constantly recalibrate, keep asking the question, what's going well, what am I passionate about, trying to follow those leads. I'm creative in my approaches, I'm buoyed up by my team, and I think most importantly, I'm kind to myself. And through that process, and sort of taking this experience out of my brain, we created the Finding Yourself model, which is this process of when you get a diagnosis in the mental health area, in particular, generally with us, ADHD, but I think it's relevant for many others as well, separating yourself from your symptoms, so who you are versus what symptoms you experience, evaluating how your symptoms are impacting your well-being, learning how to make changes, and then finding a fresh start. And so that process that we've built and that we use in our coaching and therapy is also the foundation for the book, and how we hope it will also help others find their own journeys to feeling better. And so the process that we built sort of based on this journey, which is fluid but sort of goes in order, is starting with the question of the hidden you. Who are you away from the symptoms you experience? Because if you have ADHD and you haven't found out about ADHD until adulthood, you actually might have a difficult time teasing apart where you are, your core characteristics, your sort of true self, versus the symptoms that you experience. And I actually think adults, many awake adults, are asking those same questions too. Like, I've kind of fit into this place in life now, and is it where I want to be? Is this what I was expecting? So it's this process of kind of pulling apart and saying, okay, where's my core? And yet what things are getting in the way or impacting my life? And then a deep understanding of how your brain works. That's sort of the Anne part of her presentation, where we're talking about what different factors impact whether your brain is able to engage and get things done. Your health. So ADHD is not just about whether you are doing well at work or if you're late for stuff. Lots of people make jokes about it, being a squirrel, but it's much deeper than that. It's kind of like, it's marital well-being and lots of other questions. And then this process of starting to take the lead with ADHD. How do I have a bigger voice than the symptoms that I experience? Pulling away, I am not my ADHD. Now that I'm starting to take the lead and figure out where I fit in, who's on my team, who sort of makes me move forward and encourages me and supports me, and then what environmental factors can make a difference. And we've seen clients do things as simple as, changing their morning routine, to people saying, like, I can't live in a city anymore, I need to live in the country, or I need to move out of the country, I need to be in a city so I don't have a commute. Environmental factors can make a really big difference long term. So I guess my most important message, and in sharing my story, is really about saying that the key is inside you to figure out your mental health. And there are many different teammates, and certainly ADHD comes on a spectrum, and there can be, you might need a lot of support and treatment, but that still the key inside to moving forward is inside you. And this just made me laugh. So the lady's at the library, and she's saying, so basically you're looking for books on changing everyone except yourself. So obviously the opposite of that is what we would recommend. And really working to avoid some of the ugly of ADHD. So certainly ADHD gets in the way of life, but the really most impactful part of ADHD is all the secondary symptoms that can happen from untreated ADHD. Feeling shame, feeling disappointed in yourself, feeling like you need to overcompensate, and then sort of in doing so not satisfying your own wants and needs. Being defensive. A lot of people with ADHD can really struggle with feelings of defensiveness and pushing people away because they've had a really tough narrative for a really long time. And it's scary to try to say you're gonna change when you don't know if you can. Underachievement and challenges with self-esteem. So in our view, facing ADHD means having a neutral headspace, getting to a place of deep introspection, exploring your personal narrative, being willing to be vulnerable, finding answers in the minutia. Sometimes working with clients, you find answers in the most specific little examples. You'll be talking with a client and you're in deep about what pair of running shoes they're gonna wear to the gym, and you kind of look like, how much money am I spending to talk about my running shoes? But the answer is deep in these sort of weird examples where they start to realize that's when my brain turned off, or that's when my brain turned on, and sort of figuring out these details that make up the choices that we have in our lives. And sometimes you do have to go backwards before moving forward. Sometimes there's this journey to kind of go through the emotions or look backwards to figure out some of those answers before you're able to kind of move forward in action. So why did we write this book? We wrote this book to share a guided approach about the Finding Yourself process. We hope that it will share what we have seen help so many people with ADHD at the clinic, that it will go beyond sort of our little space on Yonge Street and sort of share this message much beyond that. Because ADHD doesn't go away, but you can beat its grasp. You can beat it every day. Actually, that's how you beat it. And we put this quote in as, I think it's called an epigraph in the front of the book. It's from Cheryl Strayed, who wrote Wild, and she's a pretty amazing person and has had an amazing transformation with mental health. And she says, "It is impossible for you to go on as you were before, so you must go on as you never have." And this idea of when you come and learn something like that's the way your brain works, it gives you an opportunity to kind of shift your whole thinking and open doors that might not have been there before. And that's really why we wanted to add the 4 characters. Anne and I were on a call, I guess. The book's taken us, I think we were trying to decide if it's been 2 or 3 years. And the fact that we don't know if it's 2 or 3 is demonstrative of both of us having young kids, I think. But we were on a call one day and talking about activities and what to do, and then suddenly it hit us both. We need characters, we need stories to go through the book. And so we fell in love with these 4 characters that tell their story through the book. And I just wanted to share a couple of quotes from the book about their journey of this self-acceptance question. So Jason, who's sort of having challenges in his 20s, shares, "For me, not to be too dramatic, but it was earth-shattering. On one hand, I was relieved because it made sense, and I'd been struggling to live a certain way for a long time. I was so focused on everyone else that it felt like I finally had an answer. On the other hand, I had no idea who I was or where I fit in. If I wasn't a tornado, who was I?" Or Candace, "When I got diagnosed, I asked myself how much ADHD has led to anxiety and avoidance in my life. With this lens, my whole history came into view in a new way, and I started to want more for myself and to figure out who I wanted to be outside of anxiety and ADHD. Tim, can I say I think my past self was a jerk? No, actually, I'm sympathetic to my old self. I feel sorry for how many walls I'd built up. I was a bundle of negative coping mechanisms. The hardest part is thinking about what type of father I would still be if I'd never figured this out. Forgiving my past self has been huge. I can't believe how different I feel and am now. And lastly, Amy, I kept picturing my little self muddling along. And this might sound crazy, but I wanted to go back in time, give myself a hug and say, stop trying to do everything for everyone else. You'll find your path. I mean, that's honestly how I reacted. It took me a long time to accept that I couldn't go back and rewrite all those difficult moments, and that little person was still inside me. So it is our belief that self-awareness is your gateway. You need to know how your brain works, to control your symptoms, to take responsibility of your shortcomings, to take advantage of your gifts, to talk about the impact of ADHD on those around you, and to see past struggles and approach them differently. Because living with ADHD is a long game. So let's work together, let's share stories of hope, let's face ADHD through acceptance, and let's believe in a stigma-free future. And I usually don't like to make jokes like this, but this one just kind of made me laugh. And let's try to stay focused. What do we want? A cure for ADHD. What do we want? Squirrel. No, I don't actually like making the squirrel joke, but that one happened to get me. But really, thank you for being here tonight and for opening a dialogue about ADHD with us.